Oxygen demand rises, blood volume shifts, tissue stretches under internal pressure, a body is forced to support two metabolic clocks at once, and in most vertebrates, that trajectory ends in failure. It does not fail here. The organism, absorbing that strain, is not a mammal, not an experimental anomaly, but a male seahorse, a fish whose body accepts pregnancy as a routine load rather than a crisis. What feels wrong begins immediately, because sexual reproduction in vertebrates is not meant to be negotiable. Gametes are exchanged, roles are fixed, and pregnancy is a one-way physiological commitment. Yet in seahorses, the female deposits eggs and exits the process almost entirely, leaving the male sealed shut with dozens, sometimes hundreds, of developing embryos inside a brood pouch that must behave like an organ it was never originally built to be. The paradox is not symbolic or social, it is mechanical. The male seahorse's body must regulate oxygen, salinity, immune tolerance, waste removal, and nutrient delivery for embryos that are genetically half foreign, while still maintaining its own fragile equilibrium. And it must do so without the layered redundancies seen in mammalian placentas. There is no surplus here, no biological generosity. The pouch wall thickens and vascularizes under hormonal control. Blood chemistry shifts, ion gradients are actively tuned, and immune responses are locally suppressed, not because the system is safe, but because it has learned to operate inches from collapse. Pregnancy increases energetic demand, restricts movement, and compromises escape responses, and in the open ocean that combination is usually fatal, yet this male continues to forage, breathe, and maintain buoyancy, while carrying a growing internal load that pushes against its abdominal cavity like a slow, sustained stress test. There is no moment of adaptation where the risk disappears, the embryos grow heavier, oxygen demand rises, and the father's margin for error narrows day by day, a prolonged state where one miscalculated breath or one disrupted current could tip the balance. The unsettling part is not that this works efficiently. It does not. It works just well enough, relying on tight hormonal timing and constant physiological correction, an ongoing negotiation between survival and reproduction where neither side is allowed to fully win. From a distance, this looks like role reversal, but at close range, it is something colder, a system that discovered it could externalize female reproductive cost by internalizing male vulnerability instead, redistributing risk rather than removing it. The male seahorse does not become stronger during pregnancy, it becomes more constrained, slower, and metabolically busier, carrying life in a structure that can neither expand indefinitely nor fail gracefully. Birth itself is not relief, it is another spike in stress. Muscular contractions force fully formed juveniles out into the water column, after which the pouch must rapidly reset, inflammation subsides, and normal immune function resumes, because this body is expected to repeat the process again. Nothing about this arrangement is optimized for comfort or longevity. It persists because the ocean does not reward fairness, only persistence, and because a system that should be overwhelmed can survive if it never pretends to be safe. Inside the brood pouch, diffusion becomes destiny. There is no true placenta here, no layered interface evolved over millions of years to buffer embryos from the chaos of an adult bloodstream. Instead, the pouch wall itself must be reprogrammed into a temporary exchange surface, thin enough for oxygen and ions to pass, thick enough to avoid rupture, and stable enough to function, while surrounded by seawater that constantly tries to erase its gradients. The embryos do not float freely. They are embedded in individual compartments, each one drawing oxygen and nutrients from paternal blood vessels that proliferate under hormonal signals, similar to those seen in female vertebrates, a convergence that feels less like design and more like a workaround. Oxygen availability is the first hard limit. Seawater holds far less dissolved oxygen than air, and a pregnant male seahorse already operates near hypoxic thresholds. Every additional embryo increases demand while reducing the father's capacity to ventilate efficiently, because his upright posture and small gills are not built for high-throughput gas exchange. This forces the system into constant micro-adjustment, blood flow is redistributed, hemoglobin affinity shifts, and embryos slow their development if oxygen drops too low, a silent throttling mechanism that buys time, but not safety. Salinity is the second constraint. The pouch actively regulates ion concentrations to keep embryos from osmotic shock, pumping sodium and chloride against steep gradients, while external conditions fluctuate with tides, rainfall, and temperature, a task that consumes energy the father cannot spare. Waste removal is the third pressure point. Nitrogenous byproducts diffuse back into paternal circulation, raising metabolic load and increasing the cost of detoxification, and there is no compartmentalization to hide these errors if timing slips. Immunology completes the paradox. The embryos express foreign antigens, yet inflammation inside the pouch would be catastrophic, so immune tolerance is enforced locally, not by eliminating defense, but by suppressing it in a narrow anatomical zone, a decision that trades infection risk for reproductive success. This is not a stable equilibrium. It is a temporary truce, maintained only as long as hormonal signals remain precise and environmental stressors remain tolerable. A sudden temperature spike can accelerate embryonic metabolism beyond what oxygen delivery can sustain. A drop in salinity can overwhelm ion pumps, and bacterial intrusion can exploit suppressed immunity, turning the pouch from incubator to liability. That these failures do not occur constantly is not evidence of robustness. It is evidence of narrow margins being respected just often enough. When birth approaches, the system begins to dismantle itself. Vascularization recedes, ion regulation relaxes, immune activity returns, because the pouch cannot remain in this state indefinitely without compromising the father's survival. The unsettling reality is that this reproductive strategy works not by creating a safer environment for embryos, but by compressing risk into a short, repeatable window, betting that most cycles will end before the system destabilizes. The male seahorse does not carry life in a protected sanctuary. It carries it in a controlled leak, where exchange is constant, boundaries are thin, and the difference between development and loss is measured in gradients that can shift without warning. Vertical orientation in water is inefficient. Drag increases, stability decreases, and propulsion becomes asymmetric, a posture that turns every forward movement into a compromise between lift and balance, and yet the seahorse commits to it completely. Its body is rotated 90 degrees from the standard fish blueprint, head angled upward, tail curled downward, as if the axis of locomotion was misaligned and never corrected. Hydrodynamics do not negotiate. An upright body presents more surface area to oncoming flow, sheds vortices unpredictably, and converts muscular effort into turbulence rather than speed, meaning each tail beat returns less distance than it should. For a small marine animal, that inefficiency translates directly into energy loss, and energy loss in the ocean narrows survival windows fast. Seahorses cannot sprint away from predators, cannot chase prey, and cannot exploit burst swimming, because their dorsal fin oscillates rapidly but moves very little water per cycle, trading power for precision. This design only functions because the animal has abandoned the expectation of escape, anchoring itself to seagrass or coral with a prehensile tail that turns locomotion into positioning rather than travel. But this adaptation introduces its own ceiling. Being stationary increases exposure time, currents fluctuate, vegetation shifts, and remaining upright means the body constantly fights torque, using muscle activity just to avoid toppling. During male pregnancy, this cost compounds. The brood pouch adds mass to the front of the body, shifting the center of gravity forward and increasing the moment arm that currents can exploit, forcing continuous microcorrections to maintain posture. Oxygen demand rises not because the animal is moving fast, but because it is never truly resting, stabilizing instead of swimming, a low-level drain that never shuts off. There is no biomechanical advantage hidden here, only a redistribution of losses. Speed is sacrificed to precision, range is traded for camouflage, and escape probability is replaced with avoidance. From an evolutionary perspective, this posture persists because it aligns the head for suction feeding, allows the eyes to move independently, and keeps the body aligned with vertical plant structures. But none of those benefits remove the underlying cost. They merely justify it. The unsettling implication is that the seahorse's upright stance is not a solution to an environmental problem. It is a permanent acceptance of disadvantage, a commitment to living in a narrow slice of conditions where hydrodynamic inefficiency is survivable. Any shift in current strength, habitat density, or energy availability pushes this system closer to its limit, because there is no fallback posture, no alternative gait, only continued compensation. The body holds itself vertical not because it is optimal, but because it has no other configuration left that would work at all. Speed is the usual insurance policy in the ocean, a way to convert muscle into distance before teeth arrive, but the seahorse opts out of that contract entirely. Its body is encased in a lattice of bony plates fused beneath the skin, forming an external skeleton that resists compression and puncture while severely limiting flexibility. This armor does not make the animal strong, it makes it rigid, turning the torso into a segmented column that cannot bend into efficient swimming waves. The trade is explicit, protection is purchased with mobility, and once that decision is made, there is no partial refund. Predators do not stop hunting because prey is armored, they simply adjust tactics, and for an animal that cannot flee, every encounter becomes a test of whether hardness can outlast persistence. The plates blunt bites and frustrate crushing jaws, but they also transmit force internally, meaning impacts that would be absorbed by soft tissue are instead distributed across the skeleton, increasing the risk of internal damage that cannot be externally observed. Growth itself becomes constrained. Armor must be periodically shed and reformed during development, a process that costs energy and introduces windows of vulnerability, where plates are thinner and joints less secure. During pregnancy, rigidity compounds risk. The pouch expands, but the surrounding armored framework does not yield easily, limiting how much internal volume can be safely occupied by embryos and increasing pressure on surrounding tissues. This forces a hard ceiling on brood size, not set by reproductive potential, but by mechanical tolerance. The seahorse's survival strategy assumes it will be overlooked rather than overpowered, camouflaged among structures that match its shape and texture. Yet camouflage only functions as long as the background remains stable. Habitat degradation removes that background, exposing an animal whose armor was never meant to replace speed entirely, only to buy time. The unsettling reality is that armor creates a false sense of safety. It reduces immediate lethality while increasing long-term fragility, because once compromised, the body cannot compensate with movement. Damage accumulates silently, joints stiffen, plate alignment shifts, and efficiency drops further, pushing the energy budget into deficit. In this configuration, survival is not about resisting a single fatal event, but about avoiding a sequence of minor stresses that slowly exceed the body's limited ability to adapt. The seahorse persists not as a fortress, but as a structure that assumes the world will usually ignore it, and when that assumption fails, there is no second line of defense waiting. A digestive system without a true stomach leaves no room for delay. Seahorses lack a gastric chamber that can store and gradually process food, meaning ingested prey passes quickly through the gut, nutrients absorbed in a narrow window before being expelled, and energy must be replenished almost continuously. This design forces a feeding strategy that is relentless rather than efficient. The animal must hunt small crustaceans throughout the day, snapping them in with rapid suction that works only at close range. Each feeding event yields little surplus, and there is no buffer to draw from when prey density drops, currents shift, or daylight shortens. Metabolic demand remains constant, especially in an upright body that expends energy simply to remain stable, and during male pregnancy that demand rises further as embryos siphon resources directly from paternal circulation. The margin between intake and expenditure narrows until it is functionally non-existent, a system tuned to operate at equilibrium with almost no safety margin. Missed meals are not an inconvenience, they are a countdown, glycogen reserves deplete quickly, fat stores are minimal, and muscle catabolism begins before the animal appears outwardly compromised. Feeding itself carries risk. Seahorses must expose their heads to strike, breaking camouflage, and each strike is a brief moment of visibility that can attract attention in a crowded habitat. The paradox is that this constant foraging does not lead to abundance. It leads to maintenance, a biological treadmill where motion prevents collapse but never produces comfort. Environmental stress magnifies the problem. Temperature increases accelerate metabolism, raising energy demand without increasing prey availability, while pollution and habitat loss reduce prey density, pushing the balance into deficit. The system does not fail dramatically. It erodes, feeding frequency increases, strike efficiency declines as energy wanes, and the animal enters a feedback loop where hunger reduces hunting success, which deepens hunger further. That seahorses persist under these constraints is not evidence of resilience. It is evidence of precision. Their physiology is tuned to a narrow ecological bandwidth where prey density, temperature, and oxygen align closely enough to keep the ledger balanced. Outside that bandwidth, there is no compensatory mechanism waiting to engage, only gradual depletion. Life here is not about storing energy for later, it is about preventing the present moment from tipping irreversibly into shortage. Taken individually, none of these traits guarantee survival. Male pregnancy compresses physiological tolerance, upright posture drains energy, armor trades speed for rigidity, and constant feeding leaves no reserve. Yet together, they form a species that persists by never exceeding its limits, only grazing them. Seahorses are not robust organisms. They are precisely constrained ones, their biology calibrated to function within an unusually narrow corridor of environmental stability. Temperature, oxygen availability, salinity, habitat structure, and prey density must all remain within tolerable bounds, not because extremes are immediately lethal, but because the system lacks buffers to absorb deviation. A slight increase in temperature raises metabolic rate, which increases oxygen demand, which is already constrained by inefficient respiration and reduced mobility, while feeding requirements rise in parallel, tightening an energy budget that was never generous. Reproduction does not pause during this stress. Male pregnancy continues to draw resources, further narrowing tolerance until survival and reproduction compete directly rather than sequentially. This is where the discomfort settles in. The seahorse does not wait for favorable conditions. It proceeds regardless, because delaying reproduction carries its own evolutionary cost. Natural selection did not optimize this animal for longevity, flexibility, or resilience. It optimized it for persistence under stable conditions. And stability is not a property the ocean guarantees. The fossil record and modern distributions suggest repeated contractions and expansions, populations thinning when habitats shift, then reappearing when conditions realign, a pattern consistent with a system that collapses easily but can rebuild when constraints ease. There is no redundancy layered into this design, no alternative metabolic mode, no dormant state, no rapid dispersal mechanism, only continued operation at near maximum efficiency. That seahorses exist today is not proof that their biology is forgiving, it is proof that unforgiving systems can still persist if the environment rarely pushes them past breaking point for long enough. The unsettling conclusion is that nothing about this animal is meant to endure shock. It survives because shock has not yet become constant. In a changing ocean, a body with no safety margin does not fail loudly or suddenly, it simply runs out of allowable error and stops.